The first hours of the new war did not look like war at all. There were no declarations, no emergency broadcasts, no sudden silences on civilian networks. On the morning of September 14th, the world woke to routine headlines, market forecasts, and weather alerts. Somewhere beneath that surface, however, the global security architecture had already fractured. At 0640 UTC, an automated anomaly report was generated by NATO's Integrated Air and Missile Defense System. Three long-range radar stations in northern Norway registered simultaneous signal degradation lasting exactly 47 seconds. The event was logged as atmospheric interference, a classification that would later be revised 12 times. Within minutes, similar disruptions were detected over the Baltic Sea and eastern Canada. Individually, they meant nothing. Taken together, they formed a pattern no one wanted to name. In Brussels, the night staff at Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe forwarded the raw data up the chain with a single annotation, correlation pending. The duty general glanced at the report, noted the absence of kinetic activity, and authorized no further action. The system was doing what it was designed to do: absorb uncertainty without panic. That same hour, far from NATO command centers, Russian Northern Fleet submarines completed a long-planned redeployment beneath the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap. Officially, it was a training rotation. Unofficially, their commanders had been issued sealed orders 3 days earlier to be opened only after crossing a designated acoustic boundary. When the envelopes were opened, the instructions were brief: maintain stealth, map adversary movements, prepare for contingency activation under Directive Svarog. No shots were fired, no missiles were armed, and yet, for the first time since the Cold War, nuclear-capable platforms from opposing blocs were maneuvering under rules that assumed imminent confrontation. The first visible crack appeared not at sea, but in orbit. At 0912 UTC, an Ombre Earth observation satellite operated by a European consortium lost attitude control while passing over Central Asia. Initial assessments suggested a software malfunction. 2 hours later, a Japanese weather satellite experienced a similar failure. By midday, analysts at U.S. Space Command began comparing telemetry and noticed an anomaly in both cases: a brief spike of directed energy consistent with ground-based dazzling systems. The implication was obvious and deeply unsettling. Someone was rehearsing orbital denial, not destroying satellites, but blinding them temporarily, probing reaction thresholds. It was an escalation designed to be reversible, deniable, and strategically ambiguous. By early afternoon, secure lines between Washington, Moscow, and Beijing were active but restrained. Each side denied responsibility. Each side quietly elevated readiness levels. No one wanted to be the first to say the word attack. In the Middle East, the situation deteriorated faster. At 14:30 local time, Israeli early warning systems detected a coordinated launch of short-range rockets from southern Lebanon and western Syria. The salvo was larger than usual, but not unprecedented. Iron Dome batteries intercepted most of the incoming projectiles. A few struck open ground. One hit an electrical substation near Haifa, causing a localized blackout. What made the incident different was not the damage, but the timing. Within minutes of the launch, Iranian-backed militia channels released pre-recorded statements framing the attack as retaliation for foreign interference in regional sovereignty. The language was deliberately vague. It named no target, claimed no victory, and hinted at broader consequences. Intelligence analysts would later conclude that the messages had been prepared weeks in advance. At 15:10 UTC, the Israeli cabinet convened an emergency session. The options on the table ranged from restraint to limited strikes on known launch sites. Before a decision was reached, a new alert arrived: cyber intrusions targeting national water infrastructure traced to servers bouncing between Eastern Europe and Central Asia. The signature matched no known group exactly, It was a composite: borrowed tools, mixed tactics, intentional confusion. Someone was coordinating pressure across domains: space, cyber, proxy warfare. The United States raised its global force posture from steady state to enhanced vigilance. Carrier groups in the Mediterranean and Western Pacific were ordered to adjust positions, not toward conflict, but away from vulnerability. Bomber task forces began dispersal operations under the cover of routine drills. Publicly, officials spoke of monitoring developments. Privately, planners dusted off scenarios that had not been updated in years. In Eastern Europe, the situation was already sliding. At 1800 local time, a Polish border patrol drone operating near the Suwalki Gap lost contact and crashed. Polish authorities attributed the incident to electronic interference originating from Kaliningrad. Moscow denied involvement. 2 hours later, Lithuanian rail networks experienced unexplained signaling failures, halting freight traffic towards NATO depots. By nightfall, the map of Europe was alive with quiet disruptions: power fluctuations, GPS anomalies, communication delays. None of them justified retaliation. Together, they created an atmosphere of suffocation. The final event of the day occurred almost unnoticed. At 23:47 UTC, a U.S. Navy destroyer operating in the North Atlantic detected an unidentified underwater contact shadowing its course at extreme range. The contact maintained distance, matching speed precisely, never closing, never retreating. After 22 minutes, it vanished. The encounter was logged, classified, and archived. No one on board the ship knew it yet, but that silent presence marked the moment the shadow war turned real. The mechanisms of deterrence were still intact, but the assumptions behind them were gone. The world went to sleep believing it was at peace. It wasn't. The second day began with denials. In Moscow, the morning briefing at the Kremlin lasted 12 minutes longer than scheduled. Defense officials presented a carefully worded assessment: no hostile intent detected, no violation of sovereign territory confirmed, no justification for escalation. The president approved the statement with minor edits. Stability, the document emphasized, remained the priority. Privately, orders were issued to transition strategic forces to Condition Amber, a posture deliberately chosen for its ambiguity. It signaled readiness without provocation. In Washington, the language was similar, but the mood was not. Overnight, U.S. Cyber Command had identified coordinated intrusion attempts against logistics management systems supporting European bases. None succeeded. All originated from infrastructure that appeared civilian, scattered across 3 continents. The conclusion was blunt. This was not preparation for war. This was war conducted below the threshold of recognition. At 0720 UTC, NATO's North Atlantic Council convened in emergency session. The official agenda listed situational awareness updates. The real purpose was reassurance. Member states wanted to know whether Article 5 was drifting from deterrent to inevitability. The answer, delivered by the Secretary General, was cautious. No armed attack had occurred. Yet. That qualifier hung in the room longer than anyone liked. The first kinetic exchange of the conflict occurred far from Europe. At 0903 local time in the South China Sea, a Vietnamese offshore gas platform transmitted a distress signal reporting unidentified fast-moving surface contacts. Within minutes, the signal ceased. Satellite imagery later revealed the platform intact but abandoned. Nearby, 3 Chinese maritime militia vessels loitered in a loose formation, their transponders active, their hull numbers freshly repainted. The incident was framed as a safety evacuation. No shots were fired, no flags were raised, but insurance markets reacted instantly. Energy prices jumped. Regional navies went on alert. A space once governed by commercial contracts began reverting to gunboat logic. By mid-morning, the air over Eastern Europe grew crowded. Russian and NATO aircraft conducted parallel patrols along contested airspace corridors, each side careful to remain technically compliant while pushing proximity limits. At 11:42 local time, a German Eurofighter and a Russian Su-35 executed simultaneous intercept maneuvers near the Baltic Sea. They passed within 30 meters of each other. Cockpit footage would later circulate online, stripped of context, amplified by commentators who had already decided what it meant. In truth, both pilots were following standing orders: show presence, avoid engagement, record everything. The systems designed to prevent misunderstanding were beginning to fail under volume. At noon, a blackout struck parts of Istanbul. Initial reports blamed a transformer fire. Turkish authorities suspected more. The outage coincided with disruptions in undersea cable traffic connecting Europe to the Middle East. Redundancies absorbed most of the load, but latency spiked across financial networks. Automated trading algorithms responded faster than human analysts could intervene. By early afternoon, global markets were in freefall. Governments urged calm. Central banks issued coordinated statements. None of it stopped the momentum. Capital does not wait for clarity. The most dangerous development of the day unfolded quietly in Central Asia. At 1500 local time, a joint military exercise between two regional powers concluded ahead of schedule. Units that were scheduled to demobilize instead shifted to defensive postures near critical infrastructure. Official explanations cited logistical convenience. Intelligence services reached a different conclusion. Regional actors were hedging, preparing to secure their interests before larger powers decided for them. History had taught them what happened when vacuums appeared. As daylight faded across Europe, a single event shattered the illusion that escalation could remain abstract. At 1827 local time, an explosion rocked a fuel storage facility servicing a NATO airbase in southeastern Romania. The blast was contained. Casualties were minimal. The cause was not immediately clear. Within an hour, Romanian officials announced it as an industrial accident. NATO classified the site and restricted access. 3 hours later, forensic teams confirmed traces of shaped charges consistent with special operations sabotage. No group claimed responsibility. In Brussels, the Secretary-General authorized the first quiet reinforcement orders. Additional battalion-sized elements began moving east under the cover of scheduled rotations. Heavy equipment followed by rail and sea. The movements were defensive, legal, and entirely visible. That visibility was intentional. Deterrence required being seen. In response, Russia announced snap exercises across its western military district. The drills involved air defense units, missile brigades, and rapid deployment forces. State media emphasized preparedness, not aggression. Western analysts counted launchers. By nightfall, diplomatic channels were saturated. Calls were placed, messages exchanged, intermediaries activated. Each side insisted it did not seek war. Each side demanded restraint from the others. No one could explain how restraint was compatible with momentum already in motion. The final incident of the day occurred in space again. At 22:14 UTC, a U.S. early warning satellite briefly detected what appeared to be a missile launch signature over the Caspian region. The alert propagated through automated systems in seconds, reaching command centers before human operators could intervene. For 96 seconds, strategic forces across two continents operated under elevated alert. Then the signature vanished. Analysis later determined it had been a rare atmospheric phenomenon interacting with sensor algorithms already primed for threat detection. The system worked as designed. That was the problem. By the time the all-clear was issued, sleep was impossible in every major capital. The world was no longer sliding toward war. It was orbiting it, trapped in a tightening loop of reactions, interpretations, and automated responses. No single decision had caused the crisis. No single leader could stop it. And somewhere beneath the North Atlantic, submarines continued to track one another in silence, their crews unaware that the rules governing their actions had already changed. The third day would remove all remaining doubt. The third day began with confirmation. At 0418 UTC, seismic monitoring stations in northern Iran detected a low-yield explosion deep underground near a decommissioned missile storage complex. Iranian authorities announced an earthquake within minutes. The magnitude was plausible, the location was not. By sunrise, intelligence agencies across 3 continents agreed on a quiet consensus. The blast had been deliberate, precise, and meant to send a message without crossing a red line. No one publicly acknowledged it. Everyone adjusted their calculations. In Israel, reserve call-up notifications began appearing on personal devices under the neutral heading of civil defense readiness. In reality, armored brigades were already moving south and east, dispersing to hardened positions. The order came not from panic, but from pattern recognition. Too many vectors were aligning. Too many actors were synchronizing without coordination. At 0600 local time, Chinese naval forces initiated exclusion enforcement drills in the East China Sea. The drills overlapped with internationally recognized transit corridors. Commercial vessels were warned to reroute. Several refused. Insurance underwriters withdrew coverage within hours. The sea lanes emptied faster than any blockade could have achieved. At the same moment, a U.S. strike group operating east of the Philippines received updated rules of engagement. The language was subtle but decisive. Commanders were authorized to respond to hostile intent, not just hostile action. The difference was academic only on paper. The first casualties of the war were civilians, though no obituary would call it that. At 0743 local time, a hospital network in northern Italy lost access to patient records, diagnostic systems, and emergency coordination software. Backup servers failed to engage. Ambulances reverted to radio. Surgeries were postponed. 3 patients in critical care died within the hour. The attack left no signature, no ransom note, no ideological statement. It was later attributed to a supply chain compromise buried deep in routine software updates. The war was no longer contained to borders or uniforms. By mid-morning, the air over the Black Sea became contested. A U.S. reconnaissance drone operating in international airspace was illuminated by Russian fire control radar for 38 consecutive seconds. The drone altered course. The radar followed. NATO logged the incident as unsafe behavior. Russia released footage accusing the drone of provocation. Both statements were accurate. Both missed the point. At 0912 local time, the drone vanished from tracking screens. Debris was never recovered. The response came not with missiles, but with math. At U.S. Strategic Command, analysts recalculated escalation ladders that had not been tested outside simulations. The assumption that cyber, space, and proxy domains could absorb pressure without triggering kinetic response was quietly removed. The models did not predict apocalypse, they predicted inevitability. In the Pacific, inevitability arrived first. At 1320 local time, a Japanese destroyer escorting commercial shipping near Okinawa detected multiple high-speed contacts emerging from cluttered radar returns. The contacts resolved into unmanned surface vehicles, low-profile, autonomous, and armed with shaped charges. They moved in coordinated arcs, ignoring warning signals. Defensive fire destroyed most. 2 slipped through. 1 detonated alongside the destroyer's aft section. The damage was contained. The ship remained afloat. 8 sailors were killed instantly. Japan invoked its right to self-defense. The attacker was not identified. No nation claimed responsibility. The ambiguity satisfied no one. Within an hour, the United States and Japan activated a bilateral defense coordination protocol that had existed only on paper. Air patrols doubled. Missile defense systems went fully active. The Pacific theater crossed a threshold from readiness to engagement. In Europe, the threshold followed. At 1547 local time, an armored convoy belonging to a NATO logistics unit in eastern Poland was struck by precision artillery fire while transiting a designated training corridor. The shells impacted with near-perfect accuracy. Satellite imagery later showed the firing positions had been vacated minutes before impact. 14 soldiers were killed.
22 wounded. Russia denied involvement. Independent analysts noted the munitions matched no known Russian inventory exactly. That, too, was the point. At 1700, the North Atlantic Council reconvened. This time, the agenda included a single classified item, collective response options. The debate was brief. The vote was unanimous. Article 5 was not invoked, but preparations for its execution began immediately. The distinction mattered less with every passing hour. As evening fell across the northern hemisphere, the world entered its most dangerous phase yet. Automated defense systems, strained by anomalies and false positives, began to operate closer to their intervention thresholds. Human oversight remained in place, but decision windows shrank. The margin for doubt evaporated. At 2109 UTC, a Russian early warning radar station in Siberia detected what appeared to be multiple launches from the North Pacific. The system flagged a probable attack profile. Commanders hesitated, cross-checking with secondary sensors. The confirmation did not arrive. The alert was downgraded after 71 seconds. Those 71 seconds would later be studied in academies as the closest humanity had come to irreversible escalation. The final act of the day unfolded without witnesses. Somewhere in the Arabian Sea, two submarines, one American, one unknown, passed within lethal range of each other. Sonar logs later revealed overlapping tracking solutions, mutual awareness, and restraint. No torpedoes were fired. Both vessels disengaged. The decision not to act saved the world for one more night, but restraint was becoming an exception, not a rule. By the end of the third day, over 40 nations had elevated military readiness. Global air travel had collapsed, supply chains fractured, information space dissolved into rumor and propaganda. The phrase Third World War trended worldwide, though no government used it. They didn't need to. The war was no longer hypothetical. It was fragmented, deniable, and everywhere at once. It had no front line, only pressure points. No declaration, only consequences. And on the fourth day, the pressure would finally break.
The fourth day began with fire. At 0236 UTC, multiple explosions tore through a military logistics hub outside Constanța, Romania. Unlike the previous incident, there was no ambiguity. Surveillance footage captured the impact of loitering munitions descending almost vertically, striking fuel reserves and rail junctions with surgical precision. Air defenses engaged too late. The attack lasted less than 4 minutes. Within 10 minutes, Romanian authorities declared a state of emergency. NATO classified the strike as a coordinated military action against alliance infrastructure. For the first time since the crisis began, the language shifted internally from incident to attack. Still, no one claimed responsibility. In Moscow, the General Staff was already awake. Satellite feeds confirmed the explosions, but they also showed something else. NATO rapid response units beginning large-scale movement toward Eastern Europe, far beyond symbolic reinforcement. This was not signaling anymore. This was preparation. At 400 local time, Russia activated defensive countermeasures across its western regions. Airspace restrictions expanded. Strategic aviation dispersed to secondary airfields. Mobile missile systems left permanent bases and vanished into forested deployment zones. State media announced exercises. The wording was calm. The subtext was not. In Washington, the National Security Council convened under full secure protocol. Overnight assessments were grim. Attribution remained intentionally blurred, but the strategic effect was clear. Alliance cohesion was being tested through controlled escalation. The President approved a response framework titled Containment Phase 1. It authorized 3 actions: forward deployment of additional strike assets, offensive cyber operations against identified command and control nodes, and expanded authority for regional commanders to act preemptively against imminent threats. No missiles were launched, no speeches were given. Orders moved quietly through classified channels.
The first consequence appeared in cyberspace. At 6:15 UTC, electrical grids in parts of western Russia experienced cascading failures. Backup systems engaged, but industrial output slowed. Rail traffic halted across multiple regions. The disruption lasted less than an hour, but its precision left no doubt. This was not sabotage, this was demonstration. Russian cyber units responded in kind. By mid-morning, payment systems across several European capitals malfunctioned simultaneously. ATMs froze, digital transactions failed. Governments urged calm, while emergency protocols shifted commerce back toward analog processes that had not been used at scale in decades. The war had entered daily life. In the Middle East, restraint finally collapsed. At 9:40 local time, Israeli air defenses intercepted a wave of medium-range missiles launched from southern Syria. Two penetrated and struck a military airfield in the Negev. Casualties were limited, but the response was immediate. Within 30 minutes, Israeli aircraft crossed into Syrian airspace, striking multiple launch sites and command facilities. One of those strikes hit a compound known to house foreign advisors. Within hours, regional alliances activated. Proxy forces mobilized openly. Borders that had been tense for years ignited in hours. What had been a global crisis fractured into regional wars, all connected by the same strategic gravity. In the Pacific, gravity became momentum. At 12:50 local time, a U.S. destroyer operating near the first island chain was targeted by a hypersonic glide vehicle launched from the mainland. Early warning systems detected it late. Interceptors failed to acquire a stable solution. The weapon struck the water less than a kilometer from the ship, generating a shock wave that crippled propulsion and killed 12 sailors. China stated the launch was a test that malfunctioned. The United States did not respond publicly. Instead, B-21 bombers lifted off from remote airfields hours later, disappearing into contested airspace under heavy electronic cover. Their targets were not cities, not bases, but sensor networks, radars, relays, eyes of the battlefield, blinding, not bleeding. By evening, large sections of the Western Pacific went dark on military maps. Europe followed before nightfall. At 18:22 local time, NATO forces engaged hostile units for the first time on land. The clash occurred near the Lithuanian border during what was officially a reconnaissance patrol. Artillery fire was exchanged, drones filled the air. The engagement lasted 27 minutes. When it ended, 11 soldiers were dead. Commanders on both sides requested guidance. The guidance never came. Communications between senior leadership slowed, then fractured, overwhelmed by volume and contradictory intelligence. Regional commanders began acting on standing orders and judgment. This was not mutiny, it was structural overload. As night spread across the globe, emergency broadcasts replaced entertainment in dozens of countries. Governments urged citizens to prepare for disruptions, shortages, and uncertainty. No one used the word war in official addresses. On social networks, the word was everywhere. The final moment of the day was recorded not by soldiers, but by civilians. In a city in southern Europe, a man filmed the night sky as distant flashes illuminated the horizon, air defense intercepts beyond the suburbs. He whispered a single sentence before the clip ended. It started. By the end of the fourth day, the last illusion had died. This was no longer a crisis that could be managed, nor a conflict that could be localized. The world had crossed into a state of sustained global warfare, fragmented, asymmetrical, and accelerating. Day 5 would bring the moment everyone feared, but no one could prevent.
The fifth day erased the distinction between escalation and inevitability. At 0112 UTC, global seismic networks registered a series of controlled detonations across the Arctic Circle. The blasts were small, conventional, and precisely timed. Their purpose was not destruction, but access. Within hours, satellite imagery confirmed what analysts had feared. Multiple states had begun emergency construction and activation of hardened command facilities previously maintained in dormant status. Continuity of government protocols were no longer theoretical. The war had reached the level where survival planning replaced strategy. In Washington, senior civilian leadership relocated under classified procedures. The move was not announced. Markets noticed anyway. Within minutes, trading algorithms reacted to anomalies in government bond activity. Exchanges halted. The global financial system entered suspension mode, an action designed for catastrophe and never before executed in full. At 0340 UTC, Russia elevated its strategic deterrent forces to a posture last used during the final decade of the Cold War. The announcement was brief, deliberate, and broadcast live. No threats were issued, none were needed. China followed 2 hours later, declaring a state of comprehensive national defense readiness. Military districts were placed under unified command authority. Civilian infrastructure was formally subordinated to wartime logistics. The language echoed 20th century doctrines, updated for an era of automation and artificial intelligence. By dawn, the world understood that this phase of the conflict was no longer about advantage, it was about control over escalation itself. The breaking point came in space. At 0755 UTC, multiple anti-satellite systems were activated in low Earth orbit. Some were kinetic, others were electronic. Several satellites were disabled outright, others were blinded or pushed off stable trajectories. Within minutes, global positioning accuracy degraded, navigation errors multiplied, civil aviation grounded en masse, maritime traffic slowed to a crawl. The battlefield lost its map. Without reliable satellite data, automated defense systems reverted to degraded modes. Human operators were forced back into decision loops designed decades earlier. Reaction times lengthened, uncertainty spiked. The systems that had accelerated escalation now threatened to do the opposite, miscalculate it. At 10:18 local time in the Pacific, a U.S. early warning radar station detected a high-altitude launch signature inconsistent with known profiles. Simultaneously, Russian sensors reported anomalous activity over the North Atlantic. Chinese systems flagged interference over the Western Desert. 3 alerts, 1 planet, no common picture. For 104 seconds, nuclear command chains across the world operated under partial information, fragmented data, and human judgment alone. Launch protocols were reviewed, authentication systems were engaged, the margin between restraint and catastrophe narrowed to seconds. Then the signals resolved. They were not missiles, they were decoys, advanced hypersonic test vehicles launched without payloads, designed to probe response thresholds. Whoever authorized them had gambled that rationality would prevail. It did. The orders to stand down propagated unevenly, but in time. What followed was not relief, but exhaustion. Across all theaters, commanders reported the same condition. Forces overstretched, systems degraded, crews operating beyond sustainable limits. Ammunition stockpiles dwindled, maintenance backlogs grew. Autonomous systems deprived of stable inputs performed erratically. The war machine was consuming itself. At 1400 UTC, a breakthrough occurred not on a battlefield, but through a neutral intermediary. A secure back-channel message was transmitted simultaneously to Washington, Moscow, and Beijing. Its content was simple: a proposal for synchronized de-escalation measures, monitored cessation zones, and restoration of strategic communication links. No ceasefire, no admissions, just a pause. For 3 hours, there was no response. Then, one by one, acknowledgments arrived. At 1730 UTC, coordinated stand-down orders were issued across multiple theaters. Air patrols reduced, naval forces increased separation, cyber operations throttled back, space assets were stabilized where possible. The guns did not fall silent everywhere. Proxy conflicts continued, skirmishes flared and faded, but the escalation stopped. By nightfall, the world entered a state historians would later describe as post-escalation equilibrium. Not peace, but survival. In the days that followed, casualty estimates would remain classified. Infrastructure damage would take years to fully assess. Trust between great powers would be permanently altered. Doctrines of deterrence rewritten. No treaties marked the end. No surrender ceremonies closed the chapter. The Third World War did not end the way previous wars had. It simply ran out of certainty. What remained was a planet scarred not by ruins alone, but by the knowledge of how close it had come to erasing itself and how little separated restraint from extinction. Long after the alerts faded and the systems powered down, one question echoed through military academies and political chambers alike. Was this the war that was fought, or the one that almost was?